I need this. I want to talk with you today about enlarging your perspective on things. And I think that everybody has a kind of worldview going that they've put together over time in many different ways, but it's like a lens through which you look on life, on your life, on the world, on what's going on, what's happening, and everything, and trying to make sense out of it and trying to figure out how to be and how to live in the world. So everybody's got one of these world views, and I think that from time to time we really need to sort of wash the window lens so we can let more fresh light in and get deeper insight into it all and get a bigger, better look on everything. And Jesus does that for us. Now today, these lessons are really about the law, we call it, or the 10 Commandments. Have you heard of them? Do you know any of them? Probably we could work together and get them all, right? But, I mean, it's like your parents' favorite one, honor your father and mother. And then there's the, don't murder anybody, and don't steal stuff from other people, and don't lie about people and slander them and all of that, and don't covet stuff you don't need, and on and on. It goes, these laws that were received. So, and you find the 10 Commandments posted in synagogues and in churches and sometimes in other buildings and courts of law and other places because they're sort of universally understood to be true. They're not so much prescriptive as Christians sometimes think, like this is it, this is how to do stuff, as they are descriptive of the way God created the world and the way it works well. And when you go against, the way the world's been put together, it's not going to go well. So you can't really have a full life together as a community if people start killing each other, right? And nobody has any possessions or valuables if everybody's just take whatever you want from each other. So it's sort of common sense understandings of the way life is arranged, the way it's ordered, so to speak. So does anybody really keep the commandments perfectly? Well, you might say, well, I never murdered anybody. Well, good for you, But we're going to learn there's a lot more to it than that. So I heard this story about Marv and Myrtle. And Marv and Myrtle had a very serious discipline of worship. They followed it rigorously, religiously. They would worship once a year on Easter Sunday. And so they're great people. And the pastor finally says, Marv, Myrtle, what's the deal here? We're here every week. Why don't you come and worship with us more often? And Marv looks, well, pastor, at least we keep the 10 Commandments perfectly. And he goes, really? And then Marv says, yeah, she keeps 7 and I keep the other 3. Sometimes people look at the commandments kind of like that. Do as good as you can. Well, Jesus is going to expand our view of things. He's given us a bigger picture of how what's called the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments, fits into the whole story of what God's been up to from the beginning of time. So the whole thing about creation and life and goodness everywhere, the fall, the brokenness of life, and the redemption of the slaves in Egypt and setting free, and out in the wilderness they get these commands, and they're sort of supposed to be universal, and they're supposed to live up to them. It's a covenant God makes with them, like a marriage, saying, and this is my part, I'll be your Lord God, and this is your part, you do this, and teach the world this. Try to get people back on track, so to speak. And that's kind of a bigger picture of the understanding of what we call the Old Testament. Well, Jesus came into it, and what you heard now is part of what's called the Sermon on the Mount in chapters of Matthew 5 through 7. What happens is he takes people into a deeper spot for figuring out what God's really trying to say through the law, we'll say. And so he says things, and we heard him say, you heard it said of old by Moses, you should not murder anybody. He said, but now I say to you, there's going to be a new covenant, I say to you that if you hate your brother or anyone, that's what that word anger really says. if you hate somebody, or even if you called them, and what he says, you fool is the way it's translated, but it's really, coming out harsher than that. It's like, you stupid idiot, or the actual text says something like this. In Greek, it's out of mind, what Jesus taught them. They were so astonished, so astounded at what he was saying, because he said, if you call somebody a fool like that, you're guilty of murder. Why is that? He says, because at the root, it's the same deal. At the very root, what happens when somebody takes another person's life is they have elevated themselves above the life and given themselves the sort of arrogant ability to end somebody else's existence. Really playing God, in a way, you could say. Well, guess what? When you get into name-calling of other people, and you do it in a way that's demeaning and an assault on their personhood, what you're really saying, and this is the Aramaic which Jesus spoke behind that word, you fool, you're saying, you are a worthless nothing. That's what it says. You fool, it really should be worthless nothing. And you see, it's the same deal. You have elevated yourself in a way that is so destructive of life that you're not living into the kingdom of heaven, so to speak. So Jesus blew people's minds in that way. He went on to say, you've heard it said, you can love your neighbor and hate your enemy. No, you should love your enemy, he goes on to say, and you should pray for those who hurt you. Seriously. What? We're supposed to be doing that? I told the confirmation students on Thursday, look, you want a way to figure out your tough relationships, and somebody's picking on you, you don't like, and how to deal with them. I'm going to tell you a secret. Try this. Pray for them every day. Pray for that person. And watch what happens inside yourself. Something changes, and it will change the equation in some way. So Jesus is trying to tell them, yes, we're not going to get rid of any piece of the law, but it's all really there as a way to talk about what gives life and what destroys life. And so he's expanding people's thinking. Would you read this scripture with me? As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. In other words, we have the limitation of our human windows, and so we always have to open them up so we can get more light in to what God's ways are. Now, when we talk about the law, if you were in a synagogue this week, you would, and they wanted to talk about that, they would talk about it as the Torah. Have you heard that word? It's the Hebrew word for law. And what the Torah is, specifically, is the first 5 books of the Bible, you would call them. Maybe you know them. What are they? Genesis? Yeah. So the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments is in there, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there about life and how God deals with us. And that for them is, for Christians, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the pillars of faith in the gospel. But in Judaism and also on into Christianity, there's the Torah, the story of what God has done. And what the Pharisees did with the Torah, though, is their answer to the human condition that people keep breaking these things and sort of losing out on their life in God is try harder. And then secondly, they scoured through those first 5 books of the Torah, and they came up with 613 other commandments that they could find that you should do. And so they explained all that. People in their own lives, they said, if we can get everybody perfectly following these 10 and 613 more, the kingdom of heaven will arrive. So they're very perfectionistic about all kinds of things. But what it led them to do was divide people up into those who were, the righteous and those who were the unrighteous, those who were making it and those who were losing it, the good and the bad and so forth, and those who were really godly and those who weren't. And it worked for them as long as Jesus wasn't around. Because Jesus came to them and said, I'm not here to throw out the Torah or the law, but to fulfill it, to give it its fuller meaning. And by the way, you guys are fake. Because you're pretending that you can do all this stuff. And that's not the case. And so the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. You kind of know who they are. I think an interesting image for understanding all of this is that of an iceberg. A neat thing about photography today is you can get underwater pictures like this one. It's outstanding. So on an iceberg, you know how it goes. You got the peak of the iceberg, the tip, so to speak, and it's like tens of thousands of tons. It's a big deal. It's huge. But it's what's visible. It's what you can see. But now with this camera, look what's beneath. Hundreds of thousands of tons of weight of ice. Literally, it's a mountain floating in the sea. And that underneath stuff is the big stuff. Now, that's helpful for understanding your life in God. Most people, and Pharisees were doing this, and people like us too can get into this, is constantly focusing on the outer things, on the surface issues, on the mistakes people make, or whether they blow it here or there, and things that we can see in ourselves and in others. But Jesus is trying to tell us we need to go deeper. We need a deeper diagnosis to understand the huge thing that's underneath that's making all that happen up above. And so that's where he wants us to understand just how big our problem is, so to speak. And if you don't get that, if you end up being like a Pharisee, it will take your compassion away. It will steal your empathy. And so you'll be puffed up with yourself in a way when you come across people who seem to be sinking in life. And they'll say, it's deep, the cartoon says, and you'll be up there going, nah, it's not that deep. You say, wait a minute, I'm struggling, I'm deep in poverty, I'm trying to survive. No, it's not that deep. You can try harder. You can figure it out, kind of thing. Or no, I'm struggling with illnesses inside myself in my head that are just so complicated and they're stealing my life away. No, it's not that deep. It's not that much. Everybody can work harder at it, try harder, and you'll get yourself out. That lack of compassion, when all you deal with are the rules and the laws, and you think the way to deal with the human condition is to tighten up the laws and the rules. And we need that stuff, don't we, to monitor human behavior and to, manage it, so to speak. But no change happens there. And so, I think we read that one. Let's read this one. Read it with me. God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans see only what is visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees the heart, the real stuff, down deep. And so a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about today is the story of Ernest Hemingway. And a week ago, my wife Jan and I were in Key West. Anybody ever been there? Never been there. It was fascinating culture and place to go. Chickens running around everywhere. And then things to do. And Ernest Hemingway lived there. He had a fabulous house, and you can tour it, which we did. And this is a phenomenal author who really changed literature in our country, and both in terms of how people read it and people writing it, what was being published. All these books. Anybody read For Whom the Bell Tolls? I read that in high school. I thought it was fabulous. Right now I'm reading, because of this stuff, Farewell to Arms. The Sun Also Rises, on and on. And he wrote most of these books in that little room in his house, which you can see at that little typewriter kind of thing. He was an amazing guy. He won Nobel and Pulitzer Prizes for his writing. A lot of movies made out of his stories and things like that. The thing is, he was really a rascal. In trouble all the time. All over the man. Kind of a mess of a guy, I would say. He thought of himself as an adventurer. He's going off to do all this stuff. But really, there was a lot of insanity involved in the way he was living. Constant carousing, constant drunkenness, constant fighting, and all that, wherever he was. And his life became really miserable, and at the end, sad to say, he took his own life. Just like his father took his life. And his grandfather before him took his life. And his sister before him took her life. And his granddaughter, Margot, more recently, took her life. What's going on there? The docent guide was very helpful. He said, here's what we found out about Hemingway. They didn't have this language back then, but he clearly was bipolar. And they didn't have really any therapies or medications for bipolar back then. They do today, thank God. But he really suffered from that. And he apparently talked with his doctor about it, and his doctor said, I'm so sorry you have this, but we have nothing for you. His prescription for him was alcohol. And so, yeah, it probably helped him in some ways, but ultimately it was so destructive. And so I think about Ernest Hemingway. It's really easy for a guy like me to judge somebody for how they were living their life until I'd get down under and find out what's really going on beneath the surface. And aren't we tempted to do this a lot of times? So we say, well, that guy's addicted, that's his deal, or this person's crabby all the time, that's who they are, or this is an illegal immigrant, now I understand them, or this is somebody poor, or just an immoral lifestyle, and a prisoner, or an ex-con, or, oh, no, we have all these ways we're trying to organize in our view life and trying to understand some of the difficult stuff. But if we hang around up there, nothing gets transformed because laws don't really change people. Healing happens down low in the heart, in the depths of a human being and of human beings in general. And so the gospel story is not Jesus coming to give more rules, but to expose how we're all, in trouble, and to take a deep dive to where the real issues are. God coming with a rescue plan and help. So what are those underneath mountainous issues? They are things like people's desperate need to belong. Their desperate need to finally feel fully accepted, to be forgiven all the crud, so to speak, to be deeply, deeply loved, ultimately loved, to be cared for, to not be alone in their suffering. Because in a broken world, there's all sorts of suffering and grieving and hurts that are going on. And out of desperation, people try all sorts of things they got to get through. Jesus came down deep in order to bring the healing presence of God to anyone who would receive him. And so he hung out with desperate people. It blew people away. So he hung out with prostitutes. He hung out with the tax collectors working for the Romans. He hung out with lepers who were sick and nobody else would touch. And he would just go to what you would call the losers, the outcasts, and the sinners, and hang with them. Why? Because that's where change is going to happen. When God comes into the vulnerable places of our life, the kingdom of heaven arrives. This is the point of what he's doing there. So it's not so much about what's going on up there. It's down what happens when people get real with God and when God gets real with them, and his love becomes so dynamic and powerful in their story that it begins to change who they are. So we should never underestimate things that seem little, like coming to communion or hearing a message on the Word or praying together with other people. So all these are ways and times when Jesus, who came to suffer and die on a cross with us, for us, rise again in victory to say there's a new creation coming. These are the ways he comes to heal us little by little and then send us to do the same. So I want to talk a little bit about theology because there's still some lingering things left over from 1,000 years after Jesus. There was this guy named Anselm, who was Saint Anselm, and he taught a theology of God that some of it's still around today. And this was his understanding, his window. God is angry. God is upset. And God is angry with human people because they keep messing up his good creation. So he made it good, and they're messing it all up. And so God needs and wants to punish them. You get a punishing God out of Anselm. But he does have this care and love for people, so he didn't really want to destroy them. So what he did is he took his son, and he killed his son instead on a cross. And so he killed his son so that everybody else doesn't have to feel his anger. Well, maybe you've heard that sort of thinking around today. There are pieces of it that you can find in Scripture and all that are helpful. But there's a much better way. Francis came 200 years later, and Francis had this theology. God, the creator of the universe and every being, is nothing but pure, unadulterated, perfect, unconditional love. His love is meaning to grow out into the whole of creation and to every person. God is nothing other than pure, sheer love. And God's heart is broken when he looks at how people suffer in a broken world. And God cares so much that he would come in his son Jesus in order to restore and to heal and to retrieve and to forgive and to love every person, even so far as to go to a cross to demonstrate he's willing to suffer with us where we are in the hard stuff. But then more than that, rise again in victory in order to dawn a new age and a new life that promises already now we can taste some of that healing, that help, that restoration that allows us to be shining his love into the world. Martin Luther called it the theology of the cross. What he meant is we can't really meet God based on, I got to be good for God, or I got to be successful for God, or I got to be religious for God, or anything like that would be a disaster. Luther says it's all about the cross, and it's about our vulnerability with God and Jesus. We can get real and say, I got issues, or I'm broken, or I need help with this or that. That's theology of the cross. And so that's different than sometimes you hear in some places. But it's the importance of the cross because there is the source of healing. So if you accept that radical grace that Jesus brought for all people, it changes the way then you want to be and the way you want to be in the world. How then should we live? Not by rules and regulations and laws, but how should we be Christ's people? Here's the ABCs, in my view. First, you see trouble in other people messing up, ask the acceptance question. If I knew the story beneath and everything about that person that has led them to be who they are and the way they're acting right now, and if I had that same story, would I be much different than they are? There, but for the grace of God, go I. St. Paul wrote it, accept one another as Christ has accepted you fully and completely. That's where transformation takes place. B is to bring healing beneath the outer symptoms. So don't focus, we have to fix behaviors and deal with stuff, but always look beneath. Always try to find out the greater story and bring something to bear there that can help and bring healing. So what might that be? I don't know. I heard somebody say, be to other people the way you would want them to be when you were younger toward you. Maybe kind of helps. It's like the golden rule that's in the Sermon on the Mount, by the way. And then to really capture another view, I think in the church we need to do better at this, to cultivate a vulnerable community. So you don't have to come together with other Christian people and pretend that everything's great, or you're all right, or you're super religious, or anything like that. You can be who you are all the time together as God's people. If we talk about our strengths all the time with each other, it doesn't create community. But if we get real about, I could use some prayer on this, or that kind of thing, suddenly people are sharing, and it creates bonds of love. So Christians through history have hung out with people others wouldn't. So they hang out with prisoners, or people that's been released. The history of hanging out with people really sick, dangerously sick. They have a history of hanging out with people whose families fall apart, and there's brokenness there, or hanging out with people who live immoral lifestyles even, to try to help there somehow. And in 1,001 ways, this is the mission of the church, to go where people are vulnerable. It reminds us, too, about our own need. Like Martin Luther, on his deathbed, wrote his last words on a little scrap of paper. And when he died, they took it out of his hand, and it read, "We are all beggars." And there's a truth in that opens us up to the mighty, amazing, loving, expansive grace and love of God. This is Jesus' worldview. You could sum it up with one word. Anybody want to guess what that word would be? Could be grace, that's true. Love. And actually in the Scripture, grace and love can be the same word. So it's interesting. So, yeah, living is really all about love for God, love for yourself, love for others, and especially love for the weak, love for your enemies. Love. It's all about love. Amen?